Good morning. I'm Jennifer Leonard, President and Executive Director of the Rochester Area Community Foundation, and I thank you all for being here today. We have good news. In fact, we have exciting news about Greater Rochester's potential to shape its own future. New research commissioned by your community foundation shows the following. Using conservative estimates, Greater Rochester households hold more than $80 billion in net worth. In Monroe County alone, that's $57 billion. Ontario County is second most wealthy with almost $8 billion. Here is a map of the breakdown of current net worth across the 9-county Rochester region. Here's the kicker. In just 20 years, $34 billion, or 42% of this net worth, is expected to change hands. Now, if only a small fraction of that net worth, say 5%, benefits our region's charitable organizations, we can dramatically improve our ability as a community to address changing needs and shape a vibrant future. We have known for some time that the U.S. has begun an unprecedented transfer between generations of net worth. This intergenerational transfer of wealth, estimated at $53 trillion by 2055, comes because the World War II generation and then the baby boom generation have accumulated the greatest personal net worth in recorded history. And that net worth is beginning to change hands. Here's a graph. Here's a graph of how that transfer of wealth is expected to take place in the U.S. over the next 45 years. The U.S. numbers are in red. In blue, you'll see the transfer of wealth in New York State. More than $2 trillion between 2005 and 2055, peaking in 2035. Why do we care? What does that mean for Greater Rochester? It means we need to have a community conversation about how this wealth can transform our future. Last fall, Rochester Area Community Foundation commissioned the Rural Policy Research Institute's Center for Rural Entrepreneurship, or RUPRI, Center for Rural Entrepreneurship, to look at the coming transfer of wealth in the 9 counties of Greater Rochester. RUPRI's findings estimate a transfer by 2060, that's 50 years from now, of nearly $135 billion, or more than 1.5 times current net worth in Greater Rochester. Put another way, that's about $295,000 per household in Monroe, Ontario, Wayne, Genesee, Livingston, Seneca, Yates, Orleans, and Wyoming counties. Now, with most estates, the vast majority of assets go to heirs, even in families that have been generous during their lifetimes to charity. For generations, people lived their entire lives close to where they were born, so this inherited wealth continued to benefit our community. However, in our increasingly mobile society, more and more of the next generation is living in the South or the Sun Belt. Once their wealth leaves this community, it may never return. Let's face it, in all likelihood, it will never return. So we need to have a community conversation about how this enormous transfer of wealth can also benefit the towns, villages, and counties in which it was earned. The goal of the Community Foundation's Transfer of Wealth study is to make a broader base of charitably inclined individuals and families aware of how they can give back, improve our communities, and build an endowment to secure the future of this region and the people who live and work here. When the time comes for grandparents and parents to transfer their estates to children and grandchildren, we want them to know they have an incredible opportunity to set aside a small portion to support the communities we love. Rupre's research analyzed what would happen if just 5% of the value of estates was designated to philanthropic causes. By 2020, in just 10 years, charities would receive an estimated $695 million. By 2030, $1.7 billion. In 50 years, by 2060, if just 5% of this one-time transfer of wealth is given for charitable purposes, the region could receive $6.7 billion in charitable gifts. That includes nearly $5 billion just for Monroe County. The research also projected what would happen if the charitable giving were invested in permanent endowments for the community, the primary purpose of your community foundation. These endowments continue to provide income every year forever. By giving to endowments, the Rochester region can continue to enjoy the benefits of this one-time transfer of wealth opportunity for generations to come. Gifts to endowments typically include bequests made in a will, assignments of IRA, 401k, or insurance proceeds, and charitable trusts. Gifts such as these were used to start and build your community foundation, now among the largest in the United States with assets of $235 million. These endowments generated $17 million in grants just last year and $285 million since our founding in 1972. Now, if the community gets behind this transfer of wealth opportunity, donating 5% of estates to charity, generous donors could create endowments that would award $35 million in grants every year, each and every year, starting in just 10 years, with even more in the decades that follow. Here is a map. Here's a map showing how many millions of dollars would be available every year to our counties, beginning in 20 years, in 2030, if just 5% of the transfer of wealth were earmarked for the permanent endowments for this community. All told, $84 million a year, each and every year, to enrich our community's well-being. Think about what these millions of dollars could do for Greater Rochester. Within a decade, it would mean improved health and human services, more initiatives to care for children and teens, art and cultural endeavors that drive economic development, and increased attention to our neighborhoods and town and village centers, resulting in a better quality of life for everyone.
Jennifer said, I'm Todd Butler. I'm the President and CEO of the Ad Council of Rochester. We're a nonprofit organization that's been around in this community for 60 years, and we work with literally hundreds of nonprofit organizations each year. And these nonprofit organizations come in many shapes and sizes, and they are all part of making Rochester the strong community it is. And one of the things that Jennifer talked about at the beginning of her remarks was the idea of helping the community to be able to shape its own destiny. And that's really what the Ad Council exists to do, is to help nonprofit organizations take control of their own destiny. So all of these organizations, as I said, are different, but one thing is the same. In conversation after conversation with nonprofit after nonprofit, the number one concern is fundraising. And how do we meet an ever-increasing demand with less resources at our disposal to do it? So fundraising is what they often turn to, and the typical fundraising mix that a nonprofit organization relies on has 4 parts to it: government, corporate, foundation, and individual. And each of those facets has its own set of challenges that has only gotten greater in recent years. So the government channel has less money coming in and available now, and if we believe what we hear, less money later as well, even less later. The corporate landscape has changed in our community dramatically, and that fundraising channel is more challenging than it ever was. The foundation channel, recently some foundations have had less money to give based on the basis of poor performing investments or just downturns in the overall market. And individual, which we typically think about as individual giving, annual appeal sort of things, they're challenged because people in the community are concerned about their own jobs and concerned about the economy in general. So it can be depressing to be the CEO of a nonprofit organization. But as Jennifer said, the transfer of wealth opportunity represents $34 billion changing hands in the next 20 years. And a reasonable estimate, I think, of that, if 5% of it could be directed locally, and a significant impact of $35 million a year being available to charitable organizations and for charitable efforts in our community. So that leads us to the idea of a 5th area for nonprofit organizations to be thinking about for fundraising, and that's the area of planned giving. Now, there's more than one type of nonprofit. As I said, they come in various different shapes and sizes. And for the large nonprofits, the universities and the hospitals, they're on this. They've been thinking about this for a long time and been very active, and have actually had a great deal of success in this area. And the Community Foundation has as well. But the vast majority of nonprofit organizations, human service organizations, arts organizations, community organizations, this is something that they worry about, but aren't very actively working on. And I think that this study makes it clear that nonprofits have yet one more challenge to be added to their plate, and that's to find ways to engage their supporters in what for many organizations is a relatively new concept of giving, a longer view of the impact that the givers can have on these organizations and the community that they care about. A decade ago, the Community Foundation and the Ad Council were 2 of the partners involved in something called Willpower, which was a campaign to encourage folks to have a will, first of all, and then include charitable concerns in that will. And we had an actual measurable impact on that, and we can provide you with some detail on exactly what that impact was. But it's time to reinvigorate that conversation, and this study gives a new incentive for the community to be thinking about this, and for organizations to be nonprofit organizations to be paying more attention to it.
As an individual who was born and raised and spent my entire professional career in this community, I have to tell you that I was very privileged to get to know Joe U. Posner, who was one of the founders of the Rochester Area Community Foundation. Joe U., as we used to call him, was infamous for having at least 1 breakfast a day, and sometimes, believe it or not, 2, 3, or 4, constantly pigeonholing people and talking about the need to give back to the community. He literally wanted everyone to think of the community as one of your children, i.e. one of your heirs. I think this transfer of wealth study highlights what is possible if a lot of us start thinking the way that Joe U. thought. In my other life, I'm a CPA who specializes in estate planning. And I have to tell you, in my personal practice and in discussions that I've had with many of the other professional advisors in the community, the estate planning attorneys, the CLUs, the bank trust officers, excuse me, and the financial planners, the issue of charitable giving often comes up during our discussions with the people talking about what they want to do with the wealth that they've accumulated during their lifetimes. And it's very, very important for them to not only take care of their heirs, as Jennifer alluded to, but a lot of them are very charitably oriented. A lot of the numbers that you'll see and hear about in this transfer of wealth study that are very large numbers. But that doesn't mean that we as a community need to only rely on the millionaires here. That a not atypical estate, for an example, in this community might consist of a home, several stocks, and perhaps a retirement account that might be $500,000 up to $1 million. If we stop to think about this 5% number, that in terms of dealing with one's heirs, that let the home and the stocks go to the heirs, and if you simply take 5% of that $500,000 retirement plan, you're talking $25,000. Doesn't sound like a big number. It's not going to have a negative impact on the heirs taking that 25 out. But if we multiply that by the hundreds of thousands of people in this community, it can have a dramatic impact in terms of the community going forward. Not only for our children, our grandchildren, but for our great-grandchildren.